Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Broadcom. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead, but before we dive into things, I have just a couple of notes I'd like to review with everyone. First off, today's session is being recorded. So if you happen to miss any of our discussion, if you'd like to rewatch at a later point in time, or if you'd like to share with your team, you will be receiving an email shortly after we conclude this live session, and that email will include a link to watch the on-demand replay. Now, today, if you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options to do so. The first and the easiest option is to use the chat tab on the right side of your screen. So if you see that chat tab, I'd like you to let us know from where in the world you are joining us. Now, if you have any specific questions, we do want you to send those to our Q&A tab. We'll be holding most of our questions until the end. However, if you happen to have a timely question during any of our demos, we're going to try our best to answer them when they are as relevant and contextually relevant as possible. Additionally, if you jump over to that handout section, you'll see a couple of resources there, so feel free to grab those as we are progressing through our program today. And before we close things out, we will be giving away two $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around to see if you're one of our lucky winners today. So our topic is a developer's journey, architecting a winning DevOps strategy using CI/CD for automation at scale. And I'm joined today by Tim Higgins, Senior Solutions Architect at A&I Solutions. So Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you and let you run away with it. So let me go ahead and switch it from our slide over to your screen share.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So as we were saying, I'm going to just pull up the screen share here and the slide deck. Give it 1 second. So hopefully you all can see this. Let me know if there's any problems. And I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So if that's okay. So like we were saying, my name is Tim Higgins, Senior Solutions Architect. I've been with A&I for about 11 to 15. A&I is a partner for Broadcom. If you don't know what any of that is, you'll figure it out towards the end of this. So, and on top of that, I started my journey as a developer since birth. I've been programming since high school. I've been writing code ever since. Later became part of the whole Broadcom. At that time, it was CA. So you might hear that term loosely. CA got purchased by Broadcom. And of course, A&I has been a partner since the beginning of all of that. But today we want to focus on DevOps. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kill my camera because I'm pretty sure you all don't care what I look like. But it kind of helps give more of the real estate. So there we go. So that hopefully killed that. And let's go back over here. Now, we all know the term DevOps on a high level, right? We all have heard the term developers and operations working together. So today we want to kind of get a little bit more detailed of what that truly means, but not too much, right? Because that's not really what this presentation is about. But we're going to clean up some information, if you will. And we're going to dive deeper into what we call tools. Now, I have these three definitions, from these very well-known companies, Gartner, Amazon, and Puppet. And I'm not going to read this to you, right? Because we're all adults, we can read. But there are some very important information that you'll see that are similar between all of these. For an example, the combination of culture and philosophies, right? Best practices and tools. You also hear that it's not just tools or workflows. It's really a paradigm of how you change and do your business. And a lot of that is kind of confusing. So I like this definition, and I will read this one because this really kind of sums it up. But DevOps is a general approach to software development that is structured around a set of specific practices, concepts, and tools with the goal to improve efficiency and deliver apps at a higher speed. Now, we're going to kind of dig into what that means, okay? One thing that I don't want to do is get lost in one certain part of this, because there's so much information out there for DevOps, right? There's many places to go, from Wiki to any book from Amazon, right? Everybody's got some best practices to go about. So we're going to keep that piece at a very high level. But what I do want to explain is how the tools can help you achieve a lot of this on your own, right? And what I mean by that is there's actually companies who will come out and do this for you, right? But if you, with the proper tools, you should be able to kind of figure some of it out, right? So, and again, we'll say DevOps is developers and operations working together. Very importantly, I'm not very good at describing myself, but if you remember that earlier, I've been programming probably since mid 80s, somewhere around there. So I kind of saw a birth of a lot of this coming about. So let's talk about that. Okay, how did we get here? Now, there was a lot of methodologies, the coming into the programming world, right? So I'm trying to find the proper term. I don't think there is one, to be honest with you. But as developers, things kind of got messy, then it got clean, and then it kind of moved into a world of controlling, and then we kind of fine-lined that out. Now, what that meant was, as applications grew, so you think about your two-tier applications that became three-tier applications that became multi-tier applications that are now completely off the chain with Docker and Kubernetes and OpenShift, right? So it's no longer just a person sitting in their office just writing a simple Windows application, right? Windows applications hardly even exist anymore. Everything is cloud-based. So if you think about the history of DevOps, okay, let's get back on. I digress a little bit, so sorry about that. But when you think about the waterfall method, this was one of those that kind of just went out there and everybody jumped on, right? It was a great idea. And what it did is it came out with these methodologies, if you will, or I like calling them processes because for me, that's what they are. You started with your requirements, your software design, your implementation, your testing, your deployment, and maintenance. Maintenance is very important here. That's usually the one that got missed because, again, this is kind of a developer's world. And you'll see why here in a few minutes. The thing about the waterfall that really got messy is you couldn't do one process until another one completed. And as you see on the slide, that was a headache for bottlenecks. And then on top of that, your requirements could never change once this process started. Now, what you don't see on the slide, and you all probably know this, is waterfall means that it could take weeks or months to get that cycle complete, but then you'll go back and realize the requirements weren't even close. And with seeing that, we were joking about that back in the day. They were cartoons, right? I can't think of that one cartoon, but he was so, every developer had them on their desk. I think it started with a D, but the point is your requirements never met what the developer was thinking. But the problem is now you've already paid your developer to work weeks to write this code that now they got to go back and figure out how to sell it to the stakeholder because it wasn't what they asked for. So then we came up with this concept of agile. Now, this is a much better idea, especially for developers, because you got plan, design, develop, test, deploy, review, and launch. Okay. The idea of the agile method, and of course we hear this all the time. Most customers have a combination of the two, waterfall and agile, but it really meant that I can release quicker. Okay. I can test and I can, develop at the same time. That was a new concept because remember the waterfall, I can't go to one without the other, right? So we kind of started cleaning things up and say, hey, this mess really needs to be fixed. Number one, we're taking weeks to produce something that doesn't meet our requirements. So number two, we need to make sure that we meet our deadline, but yet still make our stakeholders happy. Our stakeholders being whoever does the requirements, right? So with that, Agile started getting a really good method, but the problem is we left out operations, kind of left them out in the dark. Now, Waterfall almost kind of brought that on with the maintenance. That's why I said that. But realistically, we still left them alone. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. So, don't go crazy yet. Bear with me on that one. But that brought us into the world of DevOps. So DevOps really started cleaning things up and said, okay, your software development life cycle is pretty good, but what about our operations team? We're kind of throwing them under the bus with this. Because remember that whole development of programming from the 80s till today, the paradigm has, and it constantly will change, has changed dramatically, right? And so the idea of a developer owning everything into production just went away. It's just too much now. There's no way they can. They still try. And you'll hear me hound the developers, but I can't. I am one, right? So, but the concept here is that we started working together with operations. Now, if you think about it, let's back it up just a second. So again, myself being a developer, developers in the real world, we really loved programming in silos. We really love to brag and program about things that we love to program. Things like new features or, just simple new ideas. We hardly ever worked on bug fixes, and we, for the most part, hated security changes, right? But the problem with that is that usually meant that it took us weeks or months to get our stuff into production because we're all perfectionists. But this also made it hard to track things like our pushes, our changes, right? The new ideas, in worst case, any bugs that come across. Because again, we didn't want to do that. That's overwork. But that also meant time to market was usually missed or obviously longer than expected. And also, once our code got in production, it was very common to miss issues and errors. And we all know that as the definition of technical debt. And a lot of that is because developers programmed in their own world. They never thought about production. They never thought about load or the end user. You'd always hear developers say, well, it works in my environment. Why don't it work in yours? Well, because they don't match. That's why. Now that brought us over to, if we think about the other perspective now, okay, let's get off the developers and think about operations. So operations themselves, when you think of sysadmins, a lot of times they have in-house rules like SLAs. And these SLAs may be that the system has to be up 99% of the time. And that usually means the answer was to throw more hardware at the application as the customer load grows. We all hear the term, disk is cheap, hardware is cheap. Well, it is, unless it's being misused. And of course, this also means the developers had to think about their deployments and how it's configured. You hear developers all the time saying, oh, well, we'll develop next week once the servers are ready, right? So that was causing the operations to schedule deployments based on the hardware, not the user stories, not the use case. In very worst case, unfortunately for operations, they were usually putting out fires or putting out bugs because they were triaging in production. And we'll get to that because there is a part of this that a lot of people forget or don't really forget, they just don't think about because it doesn't fall within their paradigm of thinking about the operations. But you should always monitor your application. Your applications should always be, we'll talk about that when we get there. I'm trying not to give too much away. But when you think about monitoring the app, doing APM monitoring, you really want to monitor the load test. You want to monitor your stack test, right? You want to make sure that what's in production, you find those issues before you get the phone call from your customer saying there's an issue. Most customers out there today, well, I wouldn't say most because I don't know the true statistics, but I do APM. So it's another product I do. And I should have said that. I'm actually a knight in DevOps and APM. So it just proves I'm a nerd. But what that really means is that when you're in monitoring your application, you want to try to be proactive, not reactive. But most people are actually in the heartbeat of putting out fires so much that it's hard to find those little things that started the fire. And we had a conversation yesterday, which was kind of cool with some of the developers for APM, is that the problem is most customers are so used to looking at our product to put out fires that they don't really see all the benefits that it has, right? All right, so let's get this off the operations. How do we fix that, right? How do we make all that change? And that's really what we're going to talk about, right? The tools and DevOps and what does it really mean? So what if we got both of these teams to work together, right? Take down those silos that I talked about. What if they shared responsibility? Like I was just saying, monitoring, right? Testing. So monitoring falls into testing, right? And we'll talk about testing in a few minutes. It doesn't, and it does, and we'll talk about that. But what if we can introduce something called automation? We all know what automation means, but what does it truly mean? Kind of like DevOps. What does it really mean? What if we can automate those workflows? Again, I call them processes. What if we can automate infrastructure? I know not every company can do that, but today with Docker and Kubernetes and OpenShift, we can talk about SV. That's not really automation, your infrastructure, but it can automate your testing. Okay, and then what if they can continue measuring the application performance like I was just saying, right? How do I teach my operations, my developers to be proactive in their design of features and not be reactive of putting out fires? And again, I've been to customers explaining, do you understand that you're spending more money on creating bugs so much that you don't have time to come up with something new or, these new ideas? So your user stories and use cases are never met because your whole team are putting out fires. And again, I like to tell stories because it puts reality to what we're saying, right? So there was one customer I had who really outsources their whole their whole I can't think what they're called, but they've got a team of developers who just really work on new features and new functionality because the in-house team are always busy putting out fires, and those are the developers, right? So again, how do we fix that? So we're going to talk about that. So let's get to automation. So automation, what does it mean? Time to change. But what if we can automate things like code testing? What if we can automate the workflows, the processes, the software the software development lifecycle, and again, the infrastructure if possible? I know not everybody can do that. One way we can start doing that is what if we think about what I said and start deploying our code in smaller chunks, smaller features, like maybe features themselves, user stories, right? That's a good one. Or bug fixes. This allows the developers to publish their code within days and not weeks or months like we did in the waterfall. We hear all the time, yeah, I got that new bug fix. Yeah, you should have. You didn't have to reinstall the whole operating system to get that bug fix. Well, hopefully you didn't, but still. Whenever you deploy your code in big chunks, you'll also have a bigger chance of missing those bugs that create technical debt. Okay. So what we need to do is start having the team work together, create a build configuration file that allows them to build on scale of the application load, which allows you to focus more on your user stories and not the hardware itself, even virtual, but it's still hardware, right? What if we can put a source control into place that allows the developers to track things like tracing, traceability, right? That's a big one. And then what if you use tools to assist you with the automation, not homegrown tools, not in-house tools, real tools, right? And then again, what if you did application monitoring that not only the operation team used, but the developers used as well, right? What if we could get them to start testing earlier with these processes, right? And we're gonna talk about that. So that's pretty much a lot of this. So let's go ahead. And of course, this brings us into CI/CD, right? Which I think is the most important part of DevOps. Not even what the little hand is saying here, but to me, you can't do DevOps without CI/CD. Okay, and I'm sure somebody can argue that, but realistically, in my mind, you can't. So again, my background is development. Okay, in the older days, like I said, we didn't really have a huge team, at least for the most part. I've been doing consultant since I graduated high school, so I've seen a lot of different developers out there. And a lot of times we just saved our code on, local machines or our own repository, right? We've always had some type of repository, even if it was just some local, right? But now today in this world, we're working international, we're working global, where our user stories are so defined that we're working as teams. Well, that doesn't work unless we share this repository, okay? If we share this source control. And again, not to digress too much, but I want to give you some realistic example. So I was a manager of a team that did a top secret software, and we were a government contractor, and my team was constantly rotating out. They were constantly changing. Okay. 1 week they may be soldiers, next week they may be, from another country, or, it was just because we were doing government contracts. So how in the world is a developer, a team lead, a manager, whatever you want to call me, how in the world can I manage the software to make sure it met the user requirements and also not wasting time? And that's a big one, right? And what I mean by that is if you came in as a team, and I know I'm hounding the developers, we're going to reverse this later, but it gets a visual of what this truly means. So if I truly had this team and I brought in a developer, I don't want to spend a half a day for this developer to try to figure out what that developer did, because that's time wasted, right? So what I did was back then, luckily, and still now I'm a big reader, Marty Fowler, if I'm saying his name right, was one of my favorite writers. He did a book called Refactoring, and in there he had a couple rules. Now we're talking about back when .NET was slowly coming on the scene. So I don't even know we had waterfall back then. I'd have to look at the date. But the point to that was he had those rules that I put into place. And like it or not, I read a lot in Microsoft as well, because, yeah, they had a lot on those processes as well. Now, The concept was my developers had to have beautiful code. And what I mean by that is your code should be so well written that a non-techie person can read what you're doing. No gibberish, no ghost code. Ghost code is the definition when you have code that's commented out. We call it ghost code because it's just lingering around and doesn't need to be there. So no ghost code, perfect naming conventions. We all agreed on this is what we should do. But not only that, but we also had an area back at the time, it was just source safe by Microsoft. We had a place for you to check in your code, but I also created the rules, don't check in broke code. Make sure your code can run before you check it in, because it's not fair for somebody else to pick up your garbage, to be honest with you, right? Because now they're going to spend another half day trying to fix your issue. Now, if you do have a bug, if you had a problem, that's fine. That's a different story. But don't check it in knowing it's broke, right? So, and then on top of that, once it's checked in, make sure you have traceability. I, as a team lead, don't want to know why you wrote this piece of code. It should have an ID that links back to the user story, right? So when you think about all that, it made life very easy. Well, as funny as it sounds, we now call that continuous integration. I got asked a couple of weeks ago, how do we get developers on board with doing these? Because developers hate processes, right? Developers hate when you bring in new rules, but the truth is we kind of invented this one. So they're kind of already doing it. And I'm actually going to show you in the demo of how simple this is. So I will show you a quick demo at the end of this, just to prove what they call it. Proof to the pudding or whatever. I don't know. I said it a few minutes ago, but I forgot what it is now. But the concept is I'm going to show you how really easy this is, and you can see why I said developers created this. So again, like I said, a single place for code, right? We all know that one. That's your source safe. Commit to the main code. What that means is, yeah, you can have branching. Any developers know what I'm talking about, but don't have your own branch. Okay, what that means is I can have a branch for QA, I can have one for, and that's a very common practice, right? QA, dev, prod, whatever. Automate the build process. When you check in your code, it should automatically kick off a build. It's very important for developers to start getting in the habit of testing early. There are some paradigms that we do that, there's a number of titles you can put out there, test first, blah, blah, blah. But the most common one is shift left with your testing. The truth is test as soon as possible, because the sooner the developers find the problems, the sooner it doesn't leak off into production. And I use the term technical debt. If you don't know what that is, it means you pushed an error or a bug into production, and it was found weeks or months or years later. And then how much does it cost to go back and redo all the stuff to try to fix that, right? Because you've had deployments on top of deployments on top of deployments. How deep is that bug? I actually had a customer who had a bug in their product, and they used it for years because they thought it was part of the product. But it wasn't. It truly was technical debt, because it cost a lot of money to remove all that. Now, but with seeing that, you want to commit every trigger to build. I already said that. You'll see that. Automate the testing process. Developers hate testing. They really do. But if I can automate it, at least I made their life kind of easier. And a universal access. We said that, right? A repository everybody can get to. Now, in all fairness, we don't want everybody to get to it, but everybody with the rights, right? You don't want to make it public, like GitHub. Some of the rules is you have to, if you use an open source, you have to share it with everybody. Well, you don't always want to do that, right? So that brought us from continuous integration. The biggest thing is, remember, developers, they kind of invented that world because they kind of had to. If not, they got very messy and their lives were worse. They also need to start thinking about testing early. But that brought us in continuous delivery. Now, even though this doesn't belong to operations, you'll see that it's kind of in that gray area. Now, continuous delivery, what does it mean? So continuous delivery means software can be deployed to production anytime. That's that build. Not that you want to, but you hear people all the time, oh, we got a mistake, let's push it to production, right? Continuous deployment. That means software is automatically deployed to production all the time. Now, that's scary. But what that's really saying is automation. So what those mean is I have a build ready to go to production. Now, reality, you're not going to go from dev to production. But again, proof to the fact, I went to a customer. They called me in because they had an issue. They had APM. Within a couple of seconds, I saw it. The problem, by asking the right question, is they pushed their code to production, but the developer did not, or whoever went through the process, right? I didn't know the flow. They didn't push the correct config file. So now their code was pointing to the wrong database. Their production code was pointing to a database that was in development, which was in a sandbox. So instantly, the production server was down because they had no data. But again, with the right process flow, the right checks, and we're going to look at how to do that very simply. That could have been overlooked. All right, so continuous operations. Let's go into this one. So if you think about beforehand, I'm going to try to speed, we're getting pretty close to the end of these because I want to show you the demo as well. But if you think about what we talk about currents before DevOps, right? So developers on one hand, operations on the other. They have a little silo wall between them. What do you want to call it? Well, our developers own their code. Ask any of them. They'll tell you they own the code, but they really do because they wrote it. It's their responsibility, blah, 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 blah. They have a source control because that's CI. They want to make sure to check in. They can create a build, right? And then they're going to do some form of testing. It can be functional, it can be UI testing, but anything, but they have some type of testing. Release, on the other hand, is actual what happens when it comes to operations, getting ready to go to the next layer. There's a set of instructions that we talked about. How do I deploy the database? How do I deploy, the IIS server, whatever. There's going to be a set of instructions that goes with your code, and then the operations deploy it to whatever environment that they need to get it into. Okay, that's kind of very high level. I think this is in this slide. That's a very high level. But here's a clean way of using DevOps to kind of get it on the same page. So I have my developers. And then I have my operations, right? And they're on the same side of the ball game, right? They're not on the left and right hand, but they're working together. So we're going to create this little box here. This little hand is, and we have our source control. It's taking those objects that we said earlier, right? No big deal. The source control creates a build, and then we're going to test it. Well, we're going to call this a pipeline. This is our build pipeline. So now let's create another pipeline. And over here, just add the other stuff. So we have our create, which is our instructions. We have the actual deploy, which is going to be your binaries or whatever you're pushing around. And of course, you need to run testing, and then it goes to whatever environment it needs to go to. And again, you're going to kind of look at this, but we're going to call this the release pipeline. Okay. Now, there's some other things got to be done, but what this kind of does is not only cleans things up into a smooth workflow, but it also gives your users, not directly, but indirectly, a contact back to the developers and operations. And we're going to see what that pipeline is. I know everybody talks about, hey, in other words, we use these terms very loosely, but you hardly ever see them. And we're going to see them at the end of this. Now, we can't do this without talking about the software lifecycle development. This really is just a higher level paradigm of how you're doing stuff. It's in this little empty loop. I always say that wrong, but it's just because it's a continuous process, right? But requirements, design, you'll recognize this, right? Development, test, and deploy, I think. Yep. This is the one I know that I used to use all the time, especially for Microsoft: plan, analyze, build, test, and deploy, right? Those are the steps you want to do. Remember the whole, and just for kicks and giggles, here's Microsoft Security Development Lifecycle. Now, this is just the new security lifecycle, right? But if you remember when I said they missed that config file in production, well, if they were using the proper, I don't want to say workflow, but the proper processes. I don't like using the workflow either because it's such a generic term, right? But if they were using the same pipelines or using this software development lifecycle and going through each process correctly, that would have never happened. And we're going to look at how easy it is to do that. So this goes to a software's journey, not a developer's journey, right? It started off as a developer's journey, but then we realized that it's not really a developer we're talking about here, it's software. So now we're going to get to tools. Now, so if you think about it, we kind of mentioned them, right? But what are the process? So product operations, analyze requirements, build, test, and deploy, publish to QA, do some more testing, and then we're going to push it on all the way to production, which then is consumed by your developers. So where do these tools fit into play? Now, most importantly, this is very important. You should always have the tools work for you. You should not work for the tools. That's a very fine statement, but basically what it means is don't build something for the tool. That's not my rule. That's been out there forever, right? I did a project for Microsoft. We were trying to do CRM, and for the life of me, I was banging my head against the wall, and because it was more of a database type thing. And if you know CRM, it's content management system. So the director called me up, and him and I just, we went and had lunch, and he says, what's going on, Tim? And I'm like, there's no way I can get CRM to fit here. And his words were, how would you do it without CRM? And then it dawned on me, well, I would just use SSIS to bring the database over to a temporary database, and then I throw a UI on for the customer to do some, some type of management with that UI if they want it with CRM. So within a couple of seconds, I had my answer because I pulled the product out of the solution, and then I put the product back to actually help me finish. So the product is always there to help you. We call it tools because just like a mechanic, just like a construction worker or an architect, they're just arsenal of tools in your toolbox, right? You would never use a screwdriver. Well, hopefully you wouldn't use a screwdriver as a hammer, like my wife does sometimes. But you would actually use the right tool for the right job. So with saying that, let's talk about the tools, and we're going to see how they come into play. I kind of highlighted Broadcom. A little biased here, but if you look at it, so products, we have our operations side of things, which is Rally, Clarity, ARD. I'm not going to go through all these, but ARD is a really, really cool tool that allows you to build requirements. I love it because I use it all the time, even when I'm told that that's not even part of the show, because if you ever use Visio, it's a way for the business and the developers to understand the requirements together. It looks like a Visio diagram, and it's very easy to understand. And it does a way, 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 way more than that. But at a very high level, that's a very good use case for it. Now, also when you get into the code, you'll notice I have dev test and service virtualization. We're going to look at that. There are some use cases where you'd want to use those tools, especially TDM when you wanted to identify PII, want to build subsets or something like that. And I'm keeping it very high level now because we'll get a little bit deeper. This bottom part is for your knowledge, and I think you get these PDFs. If you're looking for these products, these are kind of where they fall. So value ops is more of your operations side of things. When I say operations, I mean like project management type side of things. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So, and then you got DevOps, and then you got AI ops. So here's just a flat view before you go into the actual demo. And when I say a flat view, sorry, I've been talking a lot, so I'm drinking a little Gatorade there. But the flat view is taking that software development lifecycle, breaking it out and say, okay, so where do these tools truly fall in? Because we've got our process in place. We know what we're doing for development. We've got a CI/CD process put in place. Now, how do the tools come in to help? So again, plan, Rally, Clarity, ARD, development. So we can use DevTest to create service endpoints. Okay, so I want to be careful how I say that. So there's virtual machines and there's virtual services. If you've never heard of it, hopefully you all have. Virtual machines is not the same thing, right? It's virtual hardware. A virtual service is a virtual endpoint. Okay, so what that means is I can actually, it's one of my biggest products is if you go to banks, right? Banks pay for transactions. Well, I don't want to pay for a transaction to do a test. So I can put an SV in there, virtualize the endpoint, and they can go all day long. Another thing is back in the old days when I was managing a lot of teams, there was always the wait, right? It's like, what's your developers doing? Well, they're playing ping pong because they're having to wait on this department to finish what they're doing. Right? Maybe MQ, maybe C++ plugin for the mainframe, but they're always waiting. And then once they're waiting, now they're in a rush because we're past our deadline. Well, SV takes that out. So now I can virtualize what they were waiting on, and they can continue programming. It's a really, really good tool. And the same thing with TDM, Test Data Manager. It does what it says, test data. And the four functionality it does well as identify PII, mask PII, build subsets of production or whatever you're doing, because you do not want to program against the whole production database. So you can build subsets based off user stories, right? Which is perfect. Or you can create synthetic data if the data doesn't exist, or if I need more data, hint, hint, for a load testing. Okay, so moving forward, security, build. We're going to look at release automation and CDD, but there's a lot of other tools, GitHub, Jenkins, right? Those are very common. Oh, and same with development. So we don't really have a developer IDE tool like JetBrains or Eclipse or Visual Studio, but we do have DevTest and TDM that can help you with that, us being Broadcom. Again, testing, SV is part of DevTest, but DevTest does have its own testing engine, which is really, really good. You can put any kind of scripts in there, automate those. Hint, hint, developer can do that with a click of a button. Remember, I said put this back on the developer. Selenium scripts, DevTest can do Selenium, but that's a lot. You're probably You guys may have heard of JMeter and so forth, so forth. A lot of those are just running Selenium behind the scenes, some form or flavor of it. And then test data manager, your releases, your deployments. We're going to look at this and how to operate is your AI ops, which is our monitoring tools. And I'm sorry, you saw it on the other screen, but we have AXA, which does UI monitoring. We have UI being the entry point of the web page, right? HTML, JavaScript, whatever. And then we have APM, which is really good at getting at the byte level, code level. I literally have been to customers where I can see and say your developer has went beyond the bounds of an array of this method, and that's why you're running slow against this. A very good other use case too is I can say you're making too many calls to the SQL, right? Microsoft application blocks was a nightmare about that. That makes SQL calls all day long, which again is a performance hit. Developers wouldn't know that because they're in their own environment, but moving to production, your customers do know that, right? So that's where AI ops comes in. All right, so where are we? Okay, so I'll shut up and hop over here, and let's look at putting some of this into action. So I'm going to go crazy because this is my database, and I probably shouldn't do this because I haven't done this today, and it's not going to work because we're on this demo. But I'm going to say let's delete all this data. So we have a data. Let me give you some landscape, if you will. I have a little HTML application I kind of threw together. I don't like using it because it's slow. It is mine. I built it, and I did a very bad job of it because it's very slow. But the reason it's slow is because it's in Amazon, and I have it connected to like 4 or 5 different servers. So it's this pretty little thing, but I like using it for demos. I do a lot of demos, do a lot of webinars. I like it because it really puts the proof of PII data, right? So we're talking about claims here. But if I go over here and I say, Tim, you're about to do something very stupid. Let's go ahead and click on this, execute. And guess what? Just like that, we have no more data. Okay. So what are we going to do? So no data. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these tools. So we talked about Test Data Manager, right? What does Test Data Manager does? It can create data. Not just that, PII data. We're going to look at that as well. And we also have a virtual service. A virtual service means my backend that this data is coming from isn't going to exist. So I'm going to spin one up. The truth is, if you want to see it, I have it here on my server. It's just a Python. I think I wrote this one in Python. It's just a Python interface, right? But I also need to test it. So we're going to run tests again. I've created a load test and a simple test. And you're thinking, gosh, Tim, we don't have time for all this. This is release automation. We'll get to it because it takes a little bit for it to run, and I'm just going to show you. But if you go back over here, and again, don't worry, you get the slide deck. Let's look at it in this view. If you remember this process, I talked about developers doing CI. I talked about developers working with operations. Talk about how to automate all this process right here, right? So now how are we going to do it? Oh, and I talked about how the tools are here to help you, not hinder you, right? They should be your saving grace, I guess is a way to put it. I'm not sure how to put it. But so let's go. So we put in here. Now, the one thing I didn't do for sake of time is this is CIDD. I'm sorry, CDD, right? It's a application from Broadcom. And what it does, it allows you to create releases. Remember that pipeline that we talked about? Phase, workflow, whatever term you want to call it. Here it is. Dev, QA, prod. So now let's break it down to what steps happens within those, okay? So I'm going to take release automation right here is going to go take a small set of binary code that builds this IIS. If you don't know IIS or any of this, just bear with me. So I'm going to send a Slack message. I can integrate with Rally. That's where my user stories are, hint, hint. And I'm going to take those user stories and I'm going to create a TFS work item, Microsoft Team Foundation Server. It's what developers are checking in and out of code. Now here I'm using Microsoft. GitHub does the same. Jenkins does the same. We do that by passing tokens, okay? These tokens are automatically created, and these phases, by the way, they're called releases, can be dynamically created from a template. Okay. Now, with saying that, we're going to take it, notify, get. Now, I commented these out because, to be honest with you, I can't get my license to work with Rally, and TFS has changed their endpoints. Imagine that. It's Microsoft. And I didn't want to spend the time to figure out why. So I kind of commented this out, so pretend like that happens, but I'm just going to put it over here. And then we're going to create a virtual service, a fake endpoint. We're going to load some dummy data into TDM. And then I put a pause here. It says the developer starts working, but the truth is I paused it so I can show you in the apps that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. And then we're going to stop our virtual service. And then we're going to execute another build. And then we're going to create a release deployment. Okay, these are remember that automatic deployment process, right? What does that really mean? That means the developer has checked in their code is kicked off a build, that build has created what's needed to go to the next environment. That's really all that means. So in this case, I have some HTML code. If you don't know what that is, I apologize. We're going to zip it up into a file, and I'm going to push it to another server and restart its IIS. Now, then I'm going to get back into Rally and say this issue has been resolved or fixed or whatever updated. I'm going to send another Slack message that's going to go to QA. Most importantly, it's going to automatically go to QA. Now, QA is going to get another Slack. Let's go ahead and kick us off. This takes a few seconds to run. Sorry, there is one thing I forgot, and I said that. We need to fake our Rally number. So what happens is I can get the ID from Rally of what user stories this is actually tied to. Remember that whole traceability and all that cool jazz that you want to track back to? So now we can kick it off. Okay, so this is actually doing something behind the scenes, and I'll show you what it's doing in a bit. But over here in QA, while that's kicking off, we're going to contact on Slack teams, right? And this isn't just Slack, but developers love Slack. I don't know why. But you could use emails, you can use Microsoft Teams, you can use whatever you want to use, right? For those techie people, it's really API driven. I'm assuming some people here are business. That's why I say techie people too. And then we're going to run another automated deployment. Now we've got to start a QA service. We're going to now look for PII data. We're going to I put another stop in there. You don't have to manually create tests. You can do this with ARD. You can also use this with DevTest. I'm going to talk a little bit faster because I don't want to run out of time and leave questions. But here we're going to test. We're going to load, stop the service, and then more Rally updates. And then we're going to get approval to go into production. And only thing, we're going to run a load test. We're going to do it in production. We also run a load test in QA. Now we've stopped here. So let's see what I've said so far. So I'm going to come over here to dev test. Remember that virtual endpoint. And of course, I timed out. So let me refresh this one. Dev test has this really huge problem with timing out. So let me put that over here. It's only because I've had it up for a long time. Let me relog in and hopefully it'll reconnect. Let's go to, yeah, that's fine. And if I go look at my services, monitor services, BSE, I can see I now have a fake service running on port 13556. That was automatically created. Okay, cool. But what about over here? Remember, we deleted all of our data because Tim does weird stuff. And I'm going to click on this. And this is telling me that this is running and it just completed. So what does that mean for you? So if I hit refresh here, this takes about 2 hours. Just kidding. Amazon's really not the fastest for this demo. Well, the truth is I could have gave it more resources. A lot of this is running on the same server. So for sake of argument, sake of time, we're just going to look here. And look at that. We created data and we created 50 users or whatever you want to call this claims inside of our web page, which is now showing up. Okay. All I had to do is hit refresh. It just takes a little bit because it refreshes the database. So now let's go back over here real quick. And now we're going to say that the developers are done working. So we're going to run and we're going to say stop because they're done. And now it's going to stop. It's going to continue, blah, 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 blah. You guys already heard me say that. So we're going to move a little bit faster. So I'm going to ask why this process is running. Now is probably a good time if you do have any questions. There's a lot more I'm going to show you bits and pieces as it goes through, but I think you kind of get the concept at this point. What's going to happen is if I go over here and look and hit refresh, let me take it off. Well, it's already done it because of auto refresh, but notice the web service has stopped. The next phase is going to identify this as PII, and it's going to mask it for us. And you will see that, but I don't think you care to see going into production because then it's redundant. But what you're not seeing is my releases here are automatically being created in release automation. Now, if you've never seen this, what this is truly doing is I come over here and build a process. We talked about processes, nothing new. And the only thing I'm really doing is emptying out a directory and copying over the binary, which is my code, if you will. I'm doing bunny ears that came from my developers. Now, there's one important piece of that I want to show you, and then by all means, please ask questions, is the build. This is TFS, okay? And if I go over here and new, create new build. Remember I told you developers kind of created the whole CI process? Well, they kind of did if they're doing this properly. So I'm going to say I need a Visual Studio build. And again, you can use GitHub, you can use any other subversion, you can connect to different stuff. And we're just going to use the default here. Notice continue integration. Build whenever the repository is updated. So whenever they check in their code, hint, hint, it's going to kick off a build. Now, to me, this is a pre-build before this happens, right? Because I've got to get the binaries first. Let's see. Let's go ahead and just run this real quick. It's just continuing through QA. We're going to mark done. And I'll show you what that did in a few minutes. I just identified the PII. But if you notice, I didn't kick off QA. It went from dev straight to QA. Automatic. Of course, you don't want to go automatically into production. So what we're going to do, we're just going to prove here, say we're good. And then we'll kick that off. But these two will kick off automatically. This is going to run some more tests. And we'll look at that in a few seconds. Go back over here. Now over here, I'm saying update my get any requirements that you had, run the build in a solution, and then we're going to publish it. Most importantly is continue, always run. Do not continue on error, always run. So what that means is it's going to run a test. Once that's done, I can actually, before it gets done, I can add anything to this process. Jenkins, Marvin. I can run tests. Developers should be running tests. Okay. Now, with saying that, this is kind of wrapping it up. I'm going to go back to the slide deck just for a few more minutes. I'm trying to give enough time to leave for questions, but I did want to show you this. If you notice these names, okay, if I hit refresh, wait another 2 hours for it to refresh. Being sarcastic, of course. Let's go to the database just because it's faster. But if I hit refresh, again, just kind of notice the name and hit refresh. We automatically use TDM to mask our PII data. Okay, and that's very common. But what did we really, so then now she came through. So I took away this second name, right? The surname, or what do you want to call it, the last name, just to make it more audible, right? I mean, more visible. And if I go over here and look at my releases, deployments, I can see that we went from, because remember I named this 19, from dev to QA to prod, right? All this was using CDD as kind of as our orchestrator. The orchestrator put it in our flows, our processes, whatever you want to call them. We put them into a single release that could be tied to a user story back into whatever program you're using, Microsoft Project, Rally, Clarity, whatever, right? But I can also see the activities that were going on. I can actually come in here and see, let me just get some real estate. I can see my releases and how well they were performing, which one took the longest and why they took the longest, how many were automated, how much time was spent in automated tasks, how many failed. Now this wasn't one we did today, but how many failures. This is one we did today, and I can actually click on this and see how much time was spent in each step. What did we do? We actually created that release process with a CI/CD build, went through the software lifecycle development process, which again is just, this right here, I'm sorry, which really is just breaking this out, right? And we allowed the tools to automate this whole beginning to end solution all the way to production. Now, granted, you're going to have to do a little bit of work because you got to prove this one, but and the developers got to come and do some build. But the truth is, they can build before this happens, right? There's ways to integrate that whole process with ARD before it gets to this phase, and you can actually kick this phase off through a API as well. So you can truly automate the whole thing, right? And that goes back to that. Remember the one slide that I said it's kind of scary, but it's not really. This one, you really did a continuous deployment, because if I run it again, it's going to run again. If I check in my code using that build, then that build says, hey, automatically kick off a build when you do this. So to me, that build really was just a zip file, right, with the binaries inside of it. But it took that zip file, it took it to another server, it unzipped it, it created a service virtual endpoint for us to run our load test against and to put our code to. And we actually generated the code for all that. Now, I do want to kind of just walk through this, but by all means, please, anybody ask any questions in the process. These are just kind of looking at each. Let me go back to here because I'm having some slides that I did want to use. But here, again, part of your software, this is what you saw, right? I did take that one out, unfortunately. That's kind of what it looks like, right? It's just Microsoft Project or whatever, if you ever use those projects. Your build, Jenkins, GitHub, CDD. And I apologize about the CA. Remember, Broadcom bought CA. So I try to clean that up, and shame on me. But it's still release automation, so forth. Your dev test, created server virtualization, and we created test, load testing. And we didn't have time to show you all that. Sorry. TDM, release automation for our releases. Our deployments, right? We use CDD to automatically deploy. And then APM for monitoring. Okay, I did set up some monitoring at the end. I'll go back and show you that in a few seconds. TDM is really good for identifying, masking PII. These are some of your pain points, right? Generate synthetic data so you can start realistically testing early. Get your developers to do it, right? The sooner the better. The whole concept of shift left. It's not just a cool term, right? Get your developers testing. And create subsets because nobody wants to program directly out of a whole massive database from production. Dev test, right? So create virtual endpoints of backends that aren't available, third-party components. That's a very common use case, both of those. And then, of course, APM. So with saying that, I think it kind of wraps it up. I did want to show you that we did create APM dashboards, management module. We'll talk about this some other time, but you can automate all this process as well. That's your whole monitoring piece of it. So with saying that, and for the testing, let me show you. If I go home, let's see, I'm sorry. Let's go to monitor, manage test. Actually, we just do it from here and get a better view. This will take a few minutes to refresh. But this basically says we have like 3,000 tests because I've been running this and running this. So with saying that, are there any questions? I hope I wasn't on mute the whole time. That would have stunk.
Hey, Tim. So I'm not seeing any questions at this point in time. So anyone in our audience, if you do have any questions, oh, sorry, here's one right here. How do organizations ensure that their CI/CD processes are adaptable to different cloud environments and platforms?
So yeah, that's actually a good question because if you think about it, when I said automate the infrastructure as well, if that's what you're talking about. So the CI/CD, there's a lot of, I don't know how to say it without getting too detailed. There's a lot of ways that if you're talking about whenever my developers are working, right? So let's keep it stupid simple, right? And they're using Docker, then you can actually put that flow inside. Well, I guess I could have showed you this. They are a massive of plugins and endpoints. And this is just one of many tools, right? So I could put Docker in here if I need to spin up a Docker environment. And as well as your editor tool over here, whenever they check it in, again, this is just TFS, but all of them support, cloud now, right? So, and everything you're looking at here is actually in Amazon. So if you're talking about, an infrastructure as a whole, right? Like an Amazon type infrastructure, or if you're talking about just spinning it up in microservices like Docker and OpenShift, both of those are fairly not complicated to do these days. Let's see. But all this right here is cloud stuff right here. Of course, it's Microsoft because it's TFS, right? But it doesn't have to be. And there's a whole section on this where you can download other stuff like OpenShift and a lot of the new stuff that came out. So I guess the question is, if you want to put a part of your product in here or part of your release that is actually doing communication with our cloud services, you can easily do that. And if that means that you're, and keep in mind too, I didn't tell you this because we didn't talk too techie, CDD really runs a lot on APIs, right? So if I can contact it like TDM can run in the cloud because I can call it through an API. DevTest, SV, I can call those through APIs. So I can easily automate all those processes through an API as well as integrate those into Docker. And Docker, both of those products has a Docker And I'm using Docker loosely, right? Because it could be OpenShift or whatever, but it does have a Docker install. So if I need to spin a Docker up here, run my test and kill the Docker, you can do that as well. So there's a lot of options you can do with that. And my email's on here. You can definitely contact me email, and I can give you more information if that would actually help. So hopefully that was the correct answer. So.
All right. So how would one get started with getting all of this implemented? Where would be a good jumping off point and maybe a first place to start tackling it in a phased process?
So yeah, that's kind of good. So that's kind of what we were saying earlier. You wouldn't want to. I hate to use this term loosely, but you wouldn't want to jump in the ball game, without practicing. So you don't want to take pieces of it. And where I would probably start is wherever your most pain point is. So, and I know this is a loosely statement, but like if your developers really aren't using CI, if they're not creating automated builds, then none of this would truly fall into place as clean as it is. Now you could still do it by all means, but if my developers are on board, and being on board means that they're just following those simple rules that they kind of created, but they produce these binaries. And again, I'm keeping this stupid simple, right? There's a lot more to their deployments than just that. But at the end of the day, they really are just code sets that get moved around, or if it's Python or whatever. I would look at where your most pain point is. Now, I've done CDD for a lot of customers. This really isn't just about CDD. And a lot of times what we do is, this is one phase, right? What you can do is build a lot of these different phases. This is one I did a while back, where they can just be so simple. Notice there's nothing for development, right? Start build, create the build, run QA, and run a test. Right? And make that just part of your pipeline and get it used to being used by people, right? And what you'll find, there was a big airline company that I did. I was there probably about 6 months. The hardest thing was to get people to want to start using these new processes. But once they realized how simple it was, then it was kind of hard to get them to stop using it because they were using it for everything. But the point is, back to your question, is find where you're hurting the most and see if you can automate that. And what I mean by that is a good way. This unfortunately gives you an answer post-mortem. If you can get this answer pre-mortem, that's great. But if I can see what's taken the longest, right? There's some companies out there, not saying any names, but one that I did, they only push to production twice a year. So the question is, why? Is it approvals? Is it because of the development process? What is that? Try to get that deployment down. And that would be where I would start. Does that help, or does that make it worse?
No, I think that's pretty clear. We need to just find one use case, figure out how to make it work, and then see where you can expand it to the rest of the process. That totally makes sense.
Exactly. Yes.
Awesome. Well, Tim, I think we are just about out of time. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this thank you slide up. So if you would like to reach out or find out any more information, there are those contacts and the website down at the bottom left of this slide. Tim, any closing thoughts before we officially close things out?
No, I mean, other than the fact, I've obviously been doing this for a long time, but the world changes as we change going along forward. The biggest thing is, I would really, if there's anything to take away from this, is just to sit back and look at what you're doing and see if there's a way to make it easier, right? That's what the whole point of automation and tools are, is to make your life easier, not more complicated. So just like the question that was just asked, sit back and see where your pain points are and see if that is something you could automate. And it may be something you automate in 4 or 5 cycles from now, because you got to get to that, because you got to clean your developers up. But other than that, if there are questions, I've been doing this for a long time for a lot of different customers, massive size customers, all the way down to small customers. Please definitely reach out to me and ask. So.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for, one, making yourself available, but also providing the slides, the demo, really taking us into the nitty gritty of how these tools can be implemented and how they all work together. So thank you so much for the time that you've put into this today.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it. So thank you so much.
Of course. I would like to remind our audience that we have been recording today's session. You'll be receiving that recording via email shortly after we conclude today, but you'll also find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. The 2 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing, they are Nathan S. and Lars B. So to the both of you, congratulations. Keep an eye out for an email from myself. I'll be reaching out to you here shortly. If you don't find an email from me, check your spam folder just in case it happens to be filtered out. You don't want to miss out on that free money. So I would like to give a big shout out to Broadcom for sponsoring our program today. And I'd like to thank our audience for attending. We really appreciate you and your participation. Additionally, before we leave, there are those handouts in that handout section. Feel free to grab those. And pinned in the chat is a link to our survey. If you wouldn't mind just spending 1 minute filling that out for us, we would love to hear your thoughts. But regardless, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Tim, thanks again.
Yes, thanks everybody. Thank you very much.